President Trump is actively and aggressively trying to end the Russia-Ukraine war. He has been putting the strong arm on Ukraine to agree to a 30-day total ceasefire, which before they weren't. And now he's trying to put pressure on the Russian side to also agree to that. Vladimir Putin has conceptually said he agrees to it, but he's got some pretty heavy conditions that he's placed on it, a lot of questions he's asking, which leads one to wonder, is there really going to be a ceasefire? Now, one of the things that's driving President Trump, which certainly we at this channel have been in agreement with from the beginning, all the way back through, from the beginning, all the way into the Trump administration, from the Biden administration, and we're really glad to see that he's focused on the human condition. One of the things that he talked about just this morning as evidence of that is that, as we've been talking about, the Kursk incursion that Ukraine had been holding since August of last year has totally collapsed. And there's one small pocket left where there's apparently several hundred Ukraine soldiers still trapped inside. And the Russians apparently have them cut off. President Trump is concerned about their well-being. And he posted a Truth Social this morning where he brought their issue up. He said, "We have very good and productive discussions with President Vladimir Putin with Russia yesterday, and there's a very good chance that this horrible, bloody war can finally come to an end. But at this very moment, thousands of Ukraine troops are completely surrounded by the Russian military in a very bad and vulnerable position. I have strongly requested the President Putin that their lives be spared. This would be a horrible massacre, one of the worst since World War II. God bless them all." And that is consistent with what Trump has, what has been driving him is this horrible loss. And he's always been clear about saying the losses on both sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians. He views the war as unwinnable and it shouldn't have been fought. He said many times, had he been president, this war would almost certainly never have started. I happen to agree with that for very practical diplomatic reasons, but it doesn't matter. That it did happen. It is underway. And now he's trying to get the thing over. The previous administration ignored all of those realities and continued to foster the war and to keep it going and to feed it, even though any rational person could have seen that it was unwinnable, yet they were oblivious to the cost to the Ukrainian side. Well, now Trump is not. And in fact, he at a speech yesterday with Mark Rutte from the Oval Office, he emphasized again why he is so focused. And yeah, he's hoping we're close because in Jeddah last week in Saudi Arabia, Trump got a concession out of the Ukraine side that they were up to that point unwilling to have a full ceasefire. Zelensky had said very plainly he doesn't want a ceasefire on the ground. I never completely understood the logic. He wanted one on the sky and to see which were the areas both of biggest control to him. But he's losing territory on the ground and troops on the ground. So I wasn't clear why it would ever be in his interest to not have the ground included, but Trump got it out of him. And after that meeting, Zelensky himself acknowledged and said, yes, we'll go and agree to a full 30-day ceasefire. Now we have to go to the other half of the equation, and that is on the Russian side. So the question is, what is Russia's motivation? Now, as we've been telling you for a long time, for months, because this idea has been out there for a long time that the war at some point is going to have to end in a negotiated settlement. The question has always been, will it start with a ceasefire and then have negotiations where no one's being killed? Or will there be negotiations during the fighting, and then once they agree to something, then it would be stopped? Well, it was very clear what the Ukraine side would have preferred. And again, the Biden administration didn't even broach the subject. But since Trump has been in, he obviously wants a ceasefire to stop the killing first. But now Russia is playing a little bit of hardball here, and they're maintaining the consistency because up to this point, they have categorically said there won't be. In fact, it was as recently as 3 weeks ago, one of the Russian senior officials said that we will not have a ceasefire. You've seen me put from December where Sergei Lavrov said a truce is a road to nowhere. We're not going to do it. We'll talk, we'll negotiate, we'll continue to work on the details, but we'll not stop. Well, that seemed to have a bit of a subtle change when Vladimir Putin initially said, I'm open to the idea. I'm considering it, but there's some caveats that go with it. There's some nuance was a word he used, which I think is not quite the right translation or definitions are in order here because the concessions that he's talking about are a little more than nuance. They're actually quite considerate. Nobody wishes that more than I do, and I hope that he's able to do it. There obviously are things that we don't know that are going on behind the scenes. As I mentioned in a show yesterday, there are some potential sweeteners that Trump could put on the table. He does have some leverage. He does have some cards to play, but he doesn't have the power cards, which the Russian side does have. some of the things, actually many of the things he mentioned in there are actually because of their, from the Russian perspective, bad experience from the Minsk agreements back in 2015. Because in those cases, some of those issues were not resolved. They had a ceasefire first, and then they were working on negotiating details. And a lot of those things were left off the table, so they didn't get them answered. And now then Russia is saying up front that, okay, before we even agree to a ceasefire, we're going to have these big issues resolved here first. And a few of them are, as you heard him saying there at the beginning of that clip, he's looking for guarantees. The Russian side says before we'll agree to a ceasefire, we have to have some kind of guarantees that this is going to go in a direction that we want. Some of the specific issues there are who is going to be controlling the organization of these things. So there has to be some sort of infrastructure, some sort of bureaucracy that's agreed to by all parties that's going to monitor this. It's going to control it. He said, this front from the Kursk area and now probably the Sumy area. It's very soon. It's not going to be Kursk anymore because that's going to be reestablished, and the front's now going to be, as in parts it already is, in the Sumy Oblast of Ukraine. So from the Ukraine front all the way around to the Kherson area down in the south, he says it's about a 2,000-kilometer front. So he says that's a big area to monitor, and he says who's going to be monitoring that? And then who's going to be responsible for violations? That's one of the big issues that they had that was omitted from the Minsk agreements, is that there was no penalties for violations. And the OSCE was involved in that one. They were monitoring a lot of this stuff, and they would announce when there had been ceasefire violations, but there was no enforcement mechanism really for either side. And there were violations going back and forth. Later in this process, in the early part of 2022, actually before Russia invaded, the violations on the Ukraine side went sky high and went through the roof on artillery violations, which not many in the West actually want to talk about anymore, but the information is still out there on the web. You can certainly Google that, the artillery violations by the OSCE that were monitored at that time. But it doesn't matter if you accept that or not, Russia believes it. And the fact is they aren't going to agree to a ceasefire unless they can get those issues resolved and get them issues resolved in ways they like. Now, we need to understand right now, that's not something that's going to happen quickly. And the fact that Steve Witkoff, who flew to Moscow and stayed less than 24 hours and came back without making a statement, is pretty strong evidence that we're not that close to an agreement. Because I can only imagine that behind the scenes, the Russians are probably asking maybe even more than that, or saying, hey, we have some pretty high standards here that the U.S. side so far is not willing to acknowledge, because that's going to be some pretty big asks. And to give in to everything Russia is asking for is going to make the U.S. side and the Ukrainian side look weak. And Trump doesn't like to look weak. So he's trying to find some way to get this done where some of his leverage can work. So that's why I'm sure that behind the scenes, he's not saying anything against this. Trump isn't. I would imagine that he's probably trying to find some sweeteners that would not be unpalatable or too unpalatable for many in the West, but that might be enough for Putin to say, all right, we can live with that as long as A, B, and C, X, Y, and Z, whatever all his other terms are. I think it's going to be a very, very high hurdle to clear. And I have doubts that the Russian side even want to have a ceasefire, despite what Putin's saying. I think there's more and more evidence growing that they don't want one. One of the issues on the table that Putin just mentioned there was who's going to monitor the ceasefire violations, who's going to monitor this 2,000-kilometer front. Well, one group seems to think, hey, I could do that. I know who that is, and that is the European Union Plus, this coalition of the willing. At the moment, there are 37 members of that, and they're going to be meeting in, I think it's Paris tomorrow. So they're saying, hey, we'll do that. We'll meet with that, and we'll provide and I've mentioned this before, some of the comments coming out of the European side is we'll have a robust peace enforcement force. So they won't just be peacekeepers with blue helmets and rifles, but they'll have full military kit to enforce whatever peace. Now, I'm sure that on the surface, they would say, yes, that'll extend to both sides. We'll patrol this 2,000-kilometer front. And if Russia violates it, we'll do something to them. And if Ukraine violates it, we'll do something to them. Not thinking that's going to work out too well. Anybody who has a NATO patch on their shoulder, any country or any soldier from a country that wears a NATO patch under whatever flag, under whatever patch, if that troop is from a NATO country, he said they're disqualified. So they're not going to agree to that. Maybe they would agree to something with the OSCE, somebody who's not a member of NATO, maybe some other country. So even categorically, they're not necessarily opposed to any kind of peacekeeping forces or enforcement mechanism of some sort. But that's only going to be on the line that they prefer. And by the way, this related to something we said at the top, where Trump is saying, hey, I want you guys to not kill these people. This just popped on my phone, like during that clip that was played there on Telegram by Dmitry Medvedev from the National Security Council in Russia. He says, moments ago at a meeting of the permanent members of the Russian Security Council, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief said, if the Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region lay down their arms and surrender, we will guarantee them their lives and dignified treatment. This is a very humane approach by our country, but for the Ukrainian Nazis, there is also a flip side. Should they refuse to lay down their arms, they will be systematically and mercilessly eliminated. The bloodthirsty Kiev regime still has a chance to save its people. In the coming hours, we will see what they have chosen. So, on the plus side there, President Trump's plea has been answered. The Russian side is saying, we're willing to do that. We're willing to do what you've asked as long as they lay down their arms and surrender. And listen, folks, if I was a Ukraine soldier, that's exactly what I would do. That's not empty bluster, because they have them in the pocket right now. They can make good on this right here, and they can move through and systematically destroy them all. They basically got them cut off, not just under fire control, but apparently something close to being physically encircled in a pocket inside the Kursk area. So kudos for President Trump, because his diplomacy there is reaping some opportunities. Now, it just remains to be seen whether the Ukraine side will accept that deal and will follow through with something to keep their people alive. And that's a theme that I've seen a lot, and I have worries that they won't do it. I really hope to be proven wrong on that, because that's one of the motivations of President Trump, and apparently the Russians are willing to concede to that. Any possibility of getting even small-scale things like this, an agreement that turns into something that's positive, that moves towards peace and keeps people alive, we need to seize it, because every positive thing has the possibility to build to the next positive thing. But if those things are rejected and thrown away, then we go backwards. And now then the position's hardened, because what's really important to understand in all of this, Russia is in the military, economic, and production capacity pro side. They're in the advantage, irrevocable advantage. So that's important when you're understanding who can do, because if Trump wants this and tries to push hard for this, but he doesn't have the leverage to compel it, and the Russians can have the ability to say yes, or they have the power to compel no, and that they can go down another path, and there's not power to compel a stop on the other side, you see where this is likely to go. That's just the history of armed negotiations going back millennia. It doesn't matter whether the Spartans back in the thousands of years ago or these people here today that are, like right now, the fundamentals, the human fundamentals, the military fundamentals have not changed in that regard.